The lobby of the Grand Empress Hotel was a world away from the noisy city streets outside. It was a place of quiet order, where the air always smelled faintly of fresh lilac and expensive perfume. Sunlight streamed through tall, arched windows, making the polished marble floors shine like mirrors. In the center of it all, behind a long desk of dark, gleaming wood, was the man who held this world together. His name was Arthur, and he was the head concierge. He wasn't young and he wasn't old. Somewhere in that comfortable middle where a man has seen enough of life to be calm, but not so much that he's tired of it. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, but if you looked closely, you might notice the slight wear on his leather shoes. The only sign of the miles he had walked in this very lobby. Arthur's day was a carefully choreographed dance. He didn't just book tickets or call for taxis. He solved problems. He was the person you came to when you needed tickets to a sold-out show, or a special kind of tea that couldn't be found anywhere in the city, or simply a quiet moment of reassurance when your travel plans had fallen apart. He had a smile for everyone, a gentle, knowing smile that said, "Don't worry, I can handle this." He had seen the world's most famous actors, powerful politicians, and business tycoons pass through his doors. He learned early on that money didn't buy manners. In fact, it often acted like a magnifying glass, making a person's best qualities or worst flaws much bigger. On this particular Tuesday, the peaceful rhythm of the lobby was about to be broken. The glass doors swung open with a sudden push, and a man walked in as if he owned not just the hotel, but the entire city block. He was followed by two younger people who scurried to keep up, their faces fixed on him with admiring attention. This was Sterling, a name he had probably given himself. He was a tech millionaire, the kind who made a fortune from an app nobody had heard of 5 years ago, and he carried his new wealth like a heavy weapon. His suit was dark and expensive, but the fit was too sharp, a bit too loud. A huge, flashy watch glinted on his wrist, catching the light with every arrogant gesture. He moved with a restless energy, a coiled spring of impatience and self-importance. He strode right up to Arthur's desk, ignoring the line of people waiting patiently. He didn't say hello. He just tossed a set of car keys, attached to a heavy, silver fob, onto the polished wood. The clatter was loud and jarring, an ugly sound in the quiet space. It was like throwing a rock into a still pond. "Penthouse. And I need someone to take my bags." "Now," he said, his voice sharp and demanding. He didn't look at Arthur. He looked past him, as if Arthur were just another piece of furniture. Arthur didn't flinch. He simply paused his work, looked at the keys, and then up at the man. His expression didn't change, but if you were watching very closely, you might have seen a tiny flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't anger, just a deep, weary recognition. He had seen this type so many times before. "Of course, sir," Arthur said, his voice smooth and even. "Welcome to the Grand Empress. We'll have the penthouse prepared for you immediately." He gestured subtly to a bellman who quickly and quietly moved to handle the luggage. Sterling grunted, a sound of approval, and finally turned his full attention to the lobby. Scanning it like a king surveying his kingdom, his eyes landed on the baby grand piano that sat in the corner, looking elegant and timeless. It was a beautiful instrument with a sleek, black finish and ivory keys that seemed to invite a gentle touch. It wasn't just for decoration. Guests were welcome to play. Most days it sat silent. A beautiful piece of art, but sometimes in the evenings, a talented guest would sit down and fill the lobby with music, creating a magical atmosphere. Sterling had just come from a master class with a famous pianist, a session he had paid a fortune for. He was feeling full of himself, proud of the few difficult pieces he had managed to learn. He saw the piano, and a cruel idea began to form in his mind. He was a man who needed an audience, a man who needed to feel superior to others. As he was looking at the piano, he noticed Arthur. The concierge had finished checking him in and was now quietly tidying his desk, arranging a stack of brochures with precise, careful movements. As he worked, he was humming a very soft, complex melody under his breath. It was a tune full of feeling, a tune that clearly came from someone who knew and loved music. This was the opening Sterling had been waiting for. A wide, predatory smile spread across his face. He saw a chance to entertain himself, to impress his entourage, and to put this humble servant in his place all at the same time. He sauntered over to the piano, running a hand dismissively over its polished surface. "Hey, Concierge," he called out, his voice booming through the lobby. A few people looked up from their phones, surprised by the loud noise. Arthur stopped humming. He turned his head slowly, his face a polite mask. "Yes, sir? How can I help you?" Sterling laughed, a short, sharp sound. "You can help me by getting over here," he said, gesturing with a jerk of his head. "I see you humming over there. You spend all day staring at this piano, but you think you're a real artist, huh?" His voice was full of mockery. The two people with him snickered. A couple waiting for a taxi looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and looking away. Arthur felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew exactly what was happening. This was a performance, and he had just been cast as the fool. He saw the trap clear as day, but he also saw the small crowd that was starting to form, their eyes a mixture of curiosity and pity. He was trapped. With a quiet sigh that seemed to carry the weight of many years, he gave a small, almost invisible nod and began to walk toward the piano, toward the man who was about to try and break him in front of everyone. The short walk from his desk to the corner of the lobby felt like the longest journey of Arthur's life. With each step, he could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. The usual gentle hum of the hotel, the soft clinking of coffee cups, the distant ding of an elevator, the rustle of newspaper pages, had vanished. A heavy, uncomfortable silence had fallen over the space, thick with anticipation. It was the silence of a crowd holding its breath, waiting for a spectacle. Arthur kept his gaze fixed forward, his expression neutral, but inside his mind was racing. He had dealt with angry guests, with impossible demands, with people who treated him like he was invisible. But this was different. This was a public stage, and he had been forced onto it without his consent. Sterling watched him approach, his smirk growing wider. He was enjoying this, feeding off the tension he had created. He gestured grandly toward the piano bench as if he were a king offering a peasant a seat at his court. "Come on, don't be shy," he said, his voice dripping with a syrupy, insincere kindness. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, turning to the small crowd that had gathered. A few people were trying to pretend they weren't watching, staring at their phones or out the window, but their bodies were angled toward the scene. "We are about to witness a very special performance. Our humble concierge here," he said, gesturing to Arthur with a thumb, "thinks he has what it takes to be a musician. I think we should all give him a chance to prove me wrong." A few nervous titters came from the small group of people with Sterling. An older woman standing near the entrance shook her head almost imperceptibly, a look of pity on her face. Arthur felt a flush of heat rise up his neck. He wasn't ashamed of his job. He took pride in it. But this man was twisting his quiet life into a public joke. He was taking the private part of him, the part that still loved music, and dragging it into the harsh light for everyone to gawk at. "The deal is simple," Sterling continued, pacing back and forth in front of the piano like a lion in a cage. "I am going to play a little something for you all. A warm-up, really. Then our friend Arthur here is going to play a song of his choice. If he can play something that doesn't sound like a cat walking on the keys, I will personally give him $1,000. Cash." He paused for effect, letting the words hang in the air. A few of the younger guests looked impressed by the offer. "But," Sterling added, his voice turning sharp, "if he's as terrible as I expect him to be, he has to stand right here and admit to everyone that he's just a doorman with silly dreams. How does that sound, Arthur?" He finally looked directly at him, his eyes cold and challenging. Arthur stopped a few feet from the piano. He looked at Sterling, then at the expectant faces in the crowd. He saw the hotel manager standing by the reception desk, her face a mask of professional distress. She couldn't intervene. Sterling was one of their most important guests. Arthur was on his own. He knew what the smart thing to do was. He could just refuse. He could say, "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm on duty," and walk back to his desk. It would be embarrassing, but it would be over. But something in him, a spark of the pride he had tried to bury so long ago, refused to back down. This man wasn't just mocking him. He was mocking the music itself. He was treating something beautiful, something sacred, like a cheap toy. So Arthur gave a slow, deliberate nod. "All right," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I accept your challenge." A wave of excitement rippled through the lobby. Sterling clapped his hands together once, a sharp, loud crack. "Excellent! A man of courage. I like that." He rubbed his hands together and practically skipped to the piano bench. He sat down, cracked his knuckles dramatically, and adjusted his expensive suit jacket. He was putting on a show? "For my first number," he announced to his captive audience, "a little something to get the blood flowing. A piece by the great Franz Liszt." With that, his fingers came down on the keys. The sound that erupted from the piano was like an explosion. It was loud, fast, and furious. Sterling's fingers flew across the ivory keys, a blur of motion. He threw his whole body into it, his head bobbing dramatically, his face contorted with effort. He was playing a Hungarian rhapsody, a piece known for its incredible speed and technical difficulty. And he was good? There was no denying the skill it took to play that many notes that quickly. It was a dazzling display of athleticism, a musical fireworks show. The crowd was mesmerized. They had never seen anything like it. A few people pulled out their phones to record. Sterling's entourage beamed, proud of their boss. Even Arthur had to admit, from a purely technical standpoint, it was impressive. But as he listened, he felt nothing. There was no heart in the music, no soul. It was all noise and speed, a performance designed to show off, not to communicate. It was the musical equivalent of someone shouting just to hear their own voice. It was aggressive, not expressive. It was a perfect reflection of the man playing it. When Sterling finished, he slammed his hands down on the final chords, creating a crash of sound that echoed through the lobby. He jumped up from the bench, arms raised in victory. For a moment there was stunned silence. Then the lobby erupted in applause. It was the kind of applause you give after a magic trick, full of awe and surprise. Sterling took a deep bow, soaking it all in. He pointed to people in the crowd, giving them a wink and a nod. He was in his element. He finally turned back to Arthur, who had been standing patiently the whole time. The smug look on Sterling's face was almost unbearable. "So what did you think, Jeeves?" he asked, though he clearly didn't care about the answer. "Pretty good, huh? Don't worry, I won't make you play anything that hard. Just a simple tune will do. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, maybe." The crowd laughed, a little easier this time. The tension had been broken by Sterling's performance. Arthur didn't respond to the taunt. He just walked slowly toward the piano. As he moved, he did something that surprised everyone. He reached up and began to unbutton his suit jacket. He slipped it off his shoulders, revealing the crisp white shirt underneath. He folded the jacket with a slow, careful precision, as if it were a sacred cloth. He didn't just toss it on a chair. He placed it neatly on top of the piano, away from the keys. It was a small, simple gesture, but it changed everything. He was no longer just the concierge. He was a man preparing to make music. The lobby fell silent again, the laughter dying in their throats. They could all feel it. Something was about to happen. Arthur sat down on the bench, his back straight, his shoulders relaxed. He placed his fingers on the keys, and for a long moment he just sat there, his eyes closed. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The silence in the lobby was so complete, Arthur could hear the soft tick-tock of the grand clock on the far wall. He sat at the piano, his eyes still closed, his fingers resting lightly on the cool ivory keys. The entire room was frozen, waiting. Sterling stood with his arms crossed, a look of bored amusement on his face, as if he were waiting for a bad joke to be told. The small crowd of guests and staff held their collective breath, a mixture of pity and curiosity on their faces. They were all expecting a disaster, a clumsy, embarrassing attempt at music that would give the rich man his laugh. Then Arthur's fingers moved. The first note that floated into the air was not loud or sharp. It was soft, almost like a whisper. It was a single, clear sound that seemed to push all the tension out of the room. It was the complete opposite of the noise Sterling had made. Where his performance was a thunderstorm, this was the first gentle drop of rain. Another note followed, and then another, weaving together to form a melody that was both simple and incredibly deep. It was a tune full of a quiet kind of sadness, but also a strange, comforting peace. Arthur wasn't looking at the keys anymore. His hands seemed to know exactly where to go, moving with a grace and ease that was mesmerizing to watch. There was no flashy showing off, no dramatic head bobbing or body contorting. He was perfectly still, except for his hands, which danced across the keys with a life of their own. The music grew, becoming a river of sound that flowed through the lobby, washing over everyone who heard it. It was a story, told without a single word. A story of a long walk on a cool evening, of a shared glance between two people who understood each other perfectly, of a love that was so deep it felt like a quiet ache. The people in the lobby began to change. A man who had been scrolling through his phone slowly lowered it to his side, his screen forgotten. A young woman who had been whispering to her friend fell silent, her eyes wide. The hotel manager, who had been watching with a look of anxiety, now had a small, proud smile on her face. They were no longer watching a concierge being mocked. They were witnessing something special, something rare and beautiful. The music was pulling them in, asking them to forget the hotel, the wealthy man, and the silly challenge. And just listen, Sterling's smirk began to fade. He had expected to laugh. He had expected to feel superior. But as he listened, a strange feeling started to creep in. He didn't recognize the music. It wasn't a famous, showy tune like the one he had played. It was something else, something personal. He saw the way the other guests were captivated, the way their faces had softened. He looked at Arthur, who seemed to be in another world, completely lost in the music. For the first time, Sterling felt a flicker of doubt. He looked at his two companions, but they weren't looking at him. They were staring at the old man at the piano, their expressions full of wonder. He was starting to feel like the one who was out of place. As Arthur played, he was no longer in the Grand Empress Hotel. The polished marble and the crystal chandeliers had melted away. He was back in a small, cozy apartment 20 years in the past. The sunlight was streaming through a dusty window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. His wife, Clara, was lying on their old, comfortable sofa, a book resting on her chest. She was smiling at him, that gentle, loving smile that had been the center of his world. This was their song. He had played it for her 100 times. Music had been the language they spoke, a way to share feelings that were too big for words. He was a rising star then, a pianist that critics said was destined for the great concert halls of the world. But all he ever wanted was to play for her. The music swelled, becoming more passionate, more emotional. The notes were filled with a longing so powerful it was almost painful. It was the sound of a heart remembering a perfect happiness. Arthur's fingers moved faster, but it wasn't the frantic speed of Sterling's performance. It was a controlled, powerful surge of emotion, like a wave rising in the ocean. He remembered the day the doctors told them the news. He remembered the fear and the quiet promise he had made to her. He remembered playing this exact piece for her in the hospital, her hand growing weaker in his as the music filled the sterile white room. He had played for her every day until the very end. After she was gone, he couldn't touch the piano anymore. Every note was a ghost, a painful reminder of what he had lost. The music had brought him so much joy, and then it had brought him the deepest sorrow imaginable. So he had locked that part of himself away and taken a job where he could be around beauty, but not have to create it. It was safer that way. A single, glistening tear escaped from under his closed eyelid and traced a slow path down his wrinkled cheek. He didn't wipe it away. He let it fall, a tiny drop of all the years of unshed grief. The melody began to soften again, returning to the quiet, simple theme from the beginning. It was like the story was coming to an end, the memories fading back into the mist of the past. He played the final chords, not with a crash, but with a gentle, lingering touch. The last note hung in the air for a long moment, pure and clear, before it slowly faded into silence. The silence that followed was heavier and more profound than the one before. It was a sacred silence, a space filled with the echo of the music that had just been played. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stood there, lost in the beauty of what they had just heard. It was as if they had all been allowed a glimpse into someone else's soul. Then, an elderly guest who was sitting in a plush armchair in the corner slowly raised her hands and began to clap. It was a soft, slow clap, full of genuine admiration and respect. It was the sound of true appreciation. Another person joined in, and then another. Soon, the entire lobby was filled with applause. It wasn't the loud, excited clapping from before. It was deeper, more heartfelt. It was an ovation not just for a performance, but for the honesty and vulnerability of it. It was a thank you. Arthur opened his eyes. The world came back into focus. He saw the faces of the guests, all looking at him with warmth and understanding. He saw the hotel manager who was beaming at him. And then he saw Sterling. The rich man was standing perfectly still, his face pale. His arms were hanging loosely at his sides. The smirk, the arrogance, the cruelty, it was all gone. In its place was a look of utter shock and a dawning terrible shame. He had come to mock a servant and had accidentally forced a master to bare his soul. He had wanted to break the man, but instead, the man's music had broken him. The sound of the applause slowly died down, but the warmth it created in the lobby remained. It was a different kind of warmth now, not from the sunlight or the grand chandeliers, but from a shared human connection. For a long moment, no one moved. They were all still under the spell of the music, their hearts echoing with the melody they had just heard. Arthur sat at the piano, the single tear on his cheek now dry. He felt exposed, as if he had taken off his suit and revealed a lifetime of scars. The quiet dignity he had worn like armor for so many years had been stripped away. Not by force, but by his own honesty. He slowly stood up from the bench, his movements stiff and careful. He reached for his jacket, which he had placed so neatly on the piano. As he put it on, it was like he was trying to put his old self back on, to disappear into the role of the quiet, efficient concierge. He wanted to go back to his desk, to arrange brochures and answer phones, to lose himself in simple tasks, but the crowd wouldn't let him. Their eyes were on him, but the look in those eyes had changed completely. There was no more pity, no more morbid curiosity. There was only a deep, profound respect. They were no longer looking at a hotel employee. They were looking at an artist. Sterling stood frozen in the middle of the lobby, a statue carved from shame. The color had drained from his face, leaving it pale and gaunt. His arms, once crossed in a display of arrogant superiority, now hung limply at his sides. He was trying to process what had just happened. He had come here to feel powerful, to prove his own importance by belittling someone else. He had seen a quiet old man and thought he was an easy target. But the man who sat at the piano wasn't the man he had mocked. The music that came from those keys was not the clumsy fumbling he had expected. It was a voice from the soul, a story so powerful and so personal that it had shattered the noisy, empty world Sterling lived in. He felt like a child who had just been caught mocking a saint. It was at that moment that the hotel manager, a woman named Eleanor, finally stepped forward. She had been watching from the reception desk, her heart aching for Arthur and boiling with anger at the millionaire. But now she saw an opportunity. She walked calmly toward the small gathering, her heels making soft, clicking sounds on the marble floor. The crowd parted for her, their attention shifting to her. She stopped beside Arthur and placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He flinched slightly, then relaxed under her familiar touch. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor said, her voice clear and warm, carrying easily through the silent room. "I believe we have all just been privileged to witness something truly special." She paused, looking around at the captivated faces. "Many of you have known Arthur for years. You know him as the man who can always find what you need, the calm presence who makes this hotel feel like a home. But what you may not know," she continued, her voice softening with affection, "is that long before he graced us with his presence here, Arthur Pendleton was a concert pianist who played on some of the most famous stages in the world." A collective gasp rippled through the lobby. It was a soft sound, but in the quiet room it sounded like a wave crashing on the shore. People turned to look at Arthur again, their eyes wide with disbelief and wonder. Eleanor let the revelation sink in before she added the final, devastating detail. He played at Carnegie Hall? The name hung in the air, heavy with significance. Carnegie Hall, it wasn't just a place. It was a dream, the pinnacle of a classical musician's career. It was a name that commanded respect, a name that Sterling himself knew, though only as a status symbol, a place he might buy tickets to impress someone. To hear it connected to the quiet man who had just been serving him was a shock that sent him reeling. Sterling felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. Carnegie Hall, the Concierge. The two phrases didn't belong together like oil and water. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. The man he had called Jeeves, the man he had offered $1,000 to humiliate himself, was a world-class artist. The music he had heard, the music that had touched him so deeply, wasn't the work of a talented amateur. It was the work of a master. He suddenly understood the sadness in the melody, the pain that was woven into every note. This wasn't just a man who liked music. This was a man for whom music was everything, a man who had lost everything. The weight of his cruelty came crashing down on him all at once. He saw the scene again in his mind's eye, his own arrogant swagger, his loud, mocking voice, the cruel challenge he had laid out. He had seen a gentle soul and had tried to crush it for his own amusement. He hadn't just made a joke, he had committed a sacrilege. He had taken a sacred, painful memory and had dragged it out into the open for a cheap laugh. The shame was a physical force, burning in his chest and tightening his throat. He felt small and insignificant and utterly disgusting. He looked at Arthur, who was standing with his head slightly bowed, uncomfortable with all the attention. He no longer saw a servant. He saw a man who had walked with giants, who had known a level of success Sterling could only dream of buying. And he saw a man who had given it all up, probably for love, a concept Sterling had always treated as a weakness. The music suddenly made sense. It was the sound of a ghost, the ghost of a life filled with beauty and love, and the unbearable pain of having lost it. And he, Sterling Blackwood, had forced that ghost to appear. He couldn't stand to be in the room for another second. The air felt thick with his own shame. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the elevator. His entourage, who had been watching the scene with confused expressions, hurried to follow him. His grand, swaggering entrance was completely forgotten. His exit was quiet and almost defeated. He didn't look at anyone. He just kept his eyes fixed on the elevator doors, desperate for an escape. As he waited for the car to arrive, he could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, but they weren't looks of admiration anymore. They were looks of pity, not for Arthur, but for him. They had all witnessed his public humiliation, a humiliation far deeper and more real than the one he had intended for Arthur. The elevator doors opened and he stepped inside, disappearing from view. The lobby was silent once more, but now it was filled with a new story, a beautiful and heartbreaking story that everyone there would never forget. The lobby of the Grand Empress Hotel felt different after the elevator doors closed behind the wealthy man. The air was lighter, cleaner. The tension that had been coiled in the pit of everyone's stomach had unspooled, replaced by a quiet, buzzing energy. People didn't rush back to their conversations or their phones. Instead, they stood in small groups, speaking in hushed, excited tones, their faces illuminated by the shared experience. They were all part of a story now, a story they would tell for years to come. They had witnessed not a mockery, but a miracle, but for Arthur, the miracle felt more like an earthquake. The solid ground of his quiet, predictable life had cracked wide open, revealing a past he had spent decades trying to bury. He felt raw and exposed, as if he were standing in the lobby without his skin. The applause, the looks of admiration, the manager's kind words, it was all too much. He felt a desperate need to retreat, to disappear back into the safety of his role. He mumbled a quiet excuse to Eleanor and practically fled back to the sanctuary of his mahogany desk. He sat down on his familiar chair, but it no longer felt the same. The world looked at him differently now, and worse, he was starting to look at himself differently. He picked up a pen and tried to focus on the guest ledger, but the ink blurred on the page. All he could hear was the echo of his own music, the ghost of Clara's smile, and the deafening silence that had followed. He had kept that silence locked away for so long, and now it was out, wandering the lobby for everyone to see. He felt a familiar wave of grief, but there was something new mixed in with it, something he couldn't quite name. It wasn't painful, not exactly. It was warm. A tiny flickering ember in the cold ashes of his past. Later that evening, long after the last curious guest had gone to their rooms, the lobby was almost empty. Arthur was finishing up his nightly paperwork, trying to lose himself in the comforting routine of numbers and lists. The hotel was settling into its nighttime rhythm, a time he usually found peaceful. But tonight, his mind was anything but calm. He kept replaying the scene at the piano, the look on the people's faces, the devastating shame on the wealthy man's face. He wondered if he had made a mistake by playing. He had opened a door he thought he had locked forever. He was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the man approaching his desk until he was standing right in front of him. It was Sterling. He was alone. His entourage was gone. His expensive suit looked rumpled, and his face, no longer a mask of arrogance, was pale and drawn. He looked smaller somehow, without his crowd and his confidence. For a moment neither of them spoke. Arthur just looked up at him, his expression unreadable. Sterling opened his mouth, then closed it as if the words were too heavy to speak. He looked down at his expensive shoes, then back at Arthur. He started, his voice rough and uncertain. I don't know what to say. He took a deep breath. What I did, what I said, there is no excuse for it. I am a fool. A deeply, deeply foolish man. He wasn't performing now. There was no audience. This was just a man talking to another man, his voice stripped of all pretense. He continued, his gaze steady. What you shared with us today. It wasn't music. It was a life. And I tried to trample on it. I am truly, deeply sorry. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't make excuses. He just stood there, humbled and broken, and offered his apology. It was the most honest thing Arthur had ever seen him do. Arthur gave a slow, slight nod. Thank you, he said, his voice quiet. It was all he needed to say. Sterling seemed to understand. He gave another short, jerky nod of his own, then turned and walked away, his shoulders slumped. He didn't go to the penthouse elevator. He walked out the front doors and into the night. The next morning, Eleanor, the hotel manager, called Arthur into her office. She was smiling, but it was a gentle, thoughtful smile. Arthur, she said, after offering him a cup of coffee, I've been thinking a lot about yesterday. And about you. She told him that for years she had felt the hotel was missing something. It was beautiful, it was luxurious, but it lacked a soul. You have a soul, Arthur, she said, her eyes shining with sincerity. And you've been hiding it behind that desk. Then she made him an offer. The hotel had a small, elegant salon on the mezzanine level that was rarely used. It was a beautiful room with perfect acoustics, but it mostly just sat there, empty. I want to make you our hotel's first artist in residence, she announced. No more checking coats or booking taxes? I want to pay you to do what you were born to do. I want you to play for us. Not for a big crowd, not for a spectacle, just for our guests in the salon. An hour in the evening a few times a week. Whatever you are comfortable with. Arthur was stunned. It was the kind of dream he had let go of a lifetime ago. To play again, not for fame or money, but just for the love of it. The old fears immediately surfaced. The pain, the memories. But then he remembered the feeling from yesterday, the warmth of the applause, the look on people's faces. He remembered the tiny ember in his heart. He thought about it for a long moment, then he looked at Eleanor and saw the genuine belief in her eyes. He took a breath and said, yes. A week later, Eleanor received an email from the hotel's accounting department. A 6-figure donation had been made to the hotel from an anonymous source. The donor had only one request for the money. It was to be used to establish and fund the Artist in Residence program, and specifically to purchase a new concert-quality piano for the salon. Eleanor knew exactly who it was from. It wasn't an attempt to buy forgiveness. It was an act of respect, a way to honor the art he had so foolishly mocked, The story ends a month later. The new piano, a sleek and magnificent Steinway, sits in the center of the newly renovated salon. Arthur is not at his old desk. He is sitting on the bench, his fingers hovering over the keys. He is wearing a comfortable sweater, not a suit jacket. The room is small and intimate, filled with a handful of guests who are listening with a quiet reverence. He looks out at them, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. The millionaire's mockery, intended to break him, had accidentally set him free. He begins to play, and the music that fills the room is no longer a ghost of the past. It is the sound of a man who has found his way back home,